Well, that's the big picture. Now let's look at the individual authors themselves. Let's begin with Matthew. What is the evidence that Matthew wrote Matthew? We read from Papias. This is as early as AD 130. He writes, Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew dialect, and each person interpreted them as best as he could. When Papias says that Matthew wrote the sayings, this is the word logia, the words. And when he says the Hebrew dialect, surely he's referring to Aramaic. So older scholars believed that Matthew originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew, and it was later translated into Greek. That really isn't the view held by many scholars today. Instead, well, I'll give you my opinion for what it's worth. Matthew was a tax collector, and surely he knew how to read and write if he was a tax collector. And if he was following Jesus, he would have been writing down what Jesus was doing and saying. And surely he would have written this in Aramaic, his native language. So I believe that the logia, these sayings, was probably a scrapbook, a notepad of Matthew's notes that he took while Jesus was alive. I mean, picture that you're Matthew. Wouldn't you be going around writing down the things that Jesus was doing and saying? Of course you would. Well, later, this notebook that we don't have, but later this notebook that Matthew had, I believe was subsumed into his gospel. Once he wrote it, he used the notes that he took on the spot. That's my view for what it's worth. In addition, Justin Martyr, writing in AD 150, says that Matthew 16, verse 17, was something that was a record that was recorded in the memoirs of the apostles. This wasn't written by an anonymous person. This was written by an apostle. Later we read from Irenaeus, AD 180, writing out of France. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrew in their own dialect. This is the same theory as Papias. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. This would be somewhere between AD 62 to 68, somewhere in there, when Nero was in power and before their martyrdom in 67, 68. Clement of Alexandria, writing in Egypt in AD 215, he says, of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollections, and they took to writing. Matthew transmitted in writing in his native language, there it is again, the gospel according to himself. So Matthew wrote Matthew, and it seems to me that this tradition that he wrote it in Aramaic goes back to Papias, and from my perspective, this would have been his original notes. Well, let's put all of this together. We see that different authors, hundreds of miles away from one another, from Rome to Turkey to Israel to Egypt and Africa, agree that Matthew wrote Matthew, or at the very least that this book attributed to Matthew was written by a companion of Jesus, and it was written by one of the apostles. So, a wide geographic distribution. D.A. Carson says that indeed this was the universal testimony of the early church.